Okay, welcome everybody. I'd like to get started. I know some people are still coming in and grabbing lunches, so feel free to sit. There's plenty of seats left in the front, so please feel free to come on down. We're not going to call on you. We're just going to give you a great talk. My name is Yvette Subramanian. I work here at CITRIS, and I'd like to welcome people, or the web viewers. We have people from the other CITRIS campuses watching us online today. It's people from Merced, Santa Cruz, and Davis. And a few announcements. I4Energy will continue on Fridays. So Friday at noon we have a great speaker here in the auditorium. And Big Ideas is about to be announced. So if you're a student who has an idea for a proposal that could change the world using IT, the details are about to be announced, but there will be 2 writing proposals and writing proposal workshops in October. There's going to be some mixers being announced soon, and then the deadlines will be announced as well. So just keep in mind if you have anything that you're interested in talking about and learning more about for Big Ideas, we'll let you know soon. And I'd like to introduce our speaker for today. Perla is the CEO of GreatNonprofits.org. She has executive experience in corporate, academic, and nonprofit sectors, and she was the founder and former publisher of the Stanford Social Innovation Review. However, she's not from Stanford. We can claim her as our own because she has a bachelor's from the University of California at Berkeley, as well as a JD from Harvard Law School. So with that, I'd like to introduce Perla.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's wonderful to be back on campus. Can everyone hear me okay? Is the microphone okay? All right, great. So I'll begin this with a story. I was relatively young, and I was the publisher of the Stanford Social Innovation Review, which is a magazine about philanthropy and nonprofit management, published by the business school at Stanford. And in 2005, Hurricane Katrina hit. Now, this seems like many disasters ago, and it certainly was, but it was one of the most damaging events in American history, certainly one of the costliest natural disasters in this country, over $100 billion in damage. Like many of you, probably, who was there watching, the storm on your television, I wanted to do something. And my friends who said, oh, well, Perla, you're an expert in philanthropy. You published this fantastic magazine. Who should we give money to? How can we support the victims and help them recover? At the time, the Red Cross was collecting donations. And in the span of 1 month, they had collected over $1 billion in donations from individuals like you, like me, like many of my friends. And yet, at the same time, we were beginning to hear, after a couple of months, that things weren't improving, that people were still homeless. People were still without shelter and food and did not have IDs and did not have houses to go back to. One of my former colleagues took a trip out to Biloxi, Mississippi, with a girlfriend of his who was volunteering. And he saw incredible work by nonprofits, but they were not the Red Cross. They were the local organizations who were helping people who had been living in their cars, taking them to the doctor, finding them FEMA help. So this was one of the articles that he subsequently wrote. This is from David Weir, and he says, real hurricane relief from the poor is coming not from the government or from the big charities, but from the small local organizations. And for me, that was such an eye-opener, because here I was, in California. I desperately wanted to help people who were, in the same country as me. But I had no idea which local charities to support, which local charities I might recommend for people to volunteer with. So what was the source of this problem? Why, in this age of so much technology, infrastructure, why could we not find this kind of information? So this is a framework that was developed by a friend of mine, Brian Walsh, who is at LiquidNet for Good. They are actually a stock trading platform, and they have created something called Markets for Good, which is a collaboration of nonprofits starting to think about what are the gaps in the infrastructure, in the online data standards, and available information about nonprofits. So in Katrina, in 2005, we had donors who were uncertain about how their donations were going to be spent, who did not have solid information about local nonprofits and their performance, and who did little donations based upon actual performance. People gave to the Red Cross because of the name that they recognized. You have nonprofits especially local nonprofits, who had a very high cost in raising money. Local nonprofits in Biloxi were not advertising on the internet for donations. They did not know how to put on an online ad. There was a lack of ability to easily measure these nonprofits' performance, and it was very difficult for them to attract additional new funding based upon these performance metrics. Then you have the beneficiaries. Those are the people who are directly served by nonprofits. Those are the people who are the victims of Hurricane Katrina, the people who are living in their cars. They did not have a voice. No one was asking them, who are you getting help from? What is it that you need? And certainly there was no feedback mechanism to either the nonprofits or, more importantly, also in this context, to the donors as to what was working and what was not working. What was remarkable to me is when I was trying to find information about what was happening on the ground, I actually went to Craigslist, New Orleans, and I was reading through the general community boards, you know, where people usually post for rideshare and selling stuff. And there were all this incredible information and conversations about people who were saying, I'm not able to get through the Red Cross. They're not picking up the phone. Is anyone else able to get through to the Red Cross? And lots of conversations about people who were frustrated at the charities that were in place that were supposedly providing help for them. So this was an interesting challenge for me personally, and I decided that I wanted to really figure out how this information from beneficiaries can go back to nonprofits and go back to donors. So I started thinking about other social innovators in history and how they have tackled problems. So I started off with who I think was the original social innovator of modern time, at least, and that is Florence Nightingale. So Florence Nightingale was a statistician. She was also a nurse. And what she noticed is that in the hospitals that she worked in, that the hospitals that have unsanitary conditions had higher mortality and higher rates of patients being sick and dying. And her tool for making her the case that hospitals need to be more sanitary was that she collected statistics. So in the hospitals that she worked in, she literally collected data about how many people died this month, how many people died that month. And then she went around giving talks to educate people about this program. She also founded a professorship in applied statistics at Oxford, which I found very interesting. And in the course of time, this did improve hospitals and their sanitation practices, and this also led to the modern field of nursing. This was interesting for me because she was a one-woman show, and the way that she disseminated this information was very much the way that I'm disseminating information to you guys who are here physically with me, which is a one-to-one dissemination. The environmental movement was, I think, a real hallmark in how organizations and how people move an issue and create mass awareness. So the environmental movement was actually dreamed up by Senator Nelson from Wisconsin. And he thought that the way to get people to realize that our environment was being endangered was for government to make this an issue. So he was able to influence John F. Kennedy to make this part of his presidential platform. And President Kennedy did a national 11-state tour promoting environmentalism. And it was a failure. People didn't really respond. He didn't feel that excited about it. All in all, it was considered a failure. 7 years later, in 1969, the Senator Nelson had an idea. He said, what we need is a grassroots movement. We really need ordinary people to all converge on D.C. to come and make this movement a reality. So he had a staff of 85 people, and they coordinated this very grassroots effort through faxes and telephones. The New York Times was notified 5 months ahead of the event to promote the event in their articles. And as a result, 20 million Americans demonstrated, many of them in Washington, many of them in their local cities. And that was a watershed movement. But again, that was a movement that took 85 paid staff members to coordinate, and many, many years to really put together. I think the other watershed in terms of social solutions to large societal issues is Wikipedia. And Daniel Pink, in his new book, Drive, does a fascinating job of presenting the issue. So he said, imagine this is 1995, and you're talking to a couple economists, and you're asking them which encyclopedia will succeed. We've got this nascent new project called Wikipedia, in which unpaid novices will create articles about issues all around the world. Or you have Encarta, which is the effort by Microsoft. At that time, and still is, one of the most powerful software companies in the world, where professional editors, well paid, are going to write these articles, and then they're going to be distributed as a software as part of Microsoft's global distribution system. If you asked any economist in 2005, everyone would have bet on the Microsoft Encarta, and they would have been wrong. And what Wikipedia really shows us is that there's unbelievable human knowledge and potential in many of us that is untapped and could be tapped to create social solutions. So Clay Shirky, a well-known speaker on social media, estimates that there is more than 3 trillion hours of cognitive surplus in the world. That is time for people to produce knowledge as a voluntary project. So how can we use this for social good? So I started thinking about this in the context of my problem, which is how can I find out which local charities to support in the case of Hurricane Katrina or future issues. So in 2007, I launched something called GreatNonprofits. And it is an online website where beneficiaries can write reviews about their experiences with nonprofits, local nonprofits or national nonprofits. We started off in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and then we soon grew national, and now we're the leading source of feedback and stories about nonprofits with over 85,000 stories about nonprofits in our database. And pretty much you can go online and write a review about any nonprofit that you might have had an experience with, either as a client or a volunteer or even a donor. So the shorthand for it is we're like a Yelp about nonprofits. And so just an example of the kinds of stories you see, this one is a story about Goodwill in San Francisco, about their job training program. It's by this man who is M. Solomon, and I don't know if you can all read this. He says, when I came to Goodwill, I was on parole, homeless, and hardly involved with my 2 children. I was like a part-time father that wandered in and out of their lives. I did Goodwill's training program while working in the warehouse. Now my finances are in order. I'm off parole, and I can provide for my sons the right way. I can be a positive role model to them. So what you're seeing here is a demonstration of, so you have the donors on the side, or what you might want to call social investors. You have nonprofits over here. You have beneficiaries over here. And now, suddenly, you have the beginning of an interoperability model where the beneficiaries are providing feedback to this middle layer. And then this feedback can then be used by nonprofits or by donors to improve their performance or to improve their information. Some of the things that we've seen as a result is that the nonprofits whose beneficiaries say great things about them are seeing more investors and more donors. So this is an organization called Breath of Hope. They help parents with children who are born with birth defects. This woman says, Meg Skaggs says, I will never forget the day that I received a care package from Breath of Hope. My son was 16 days old and fighting for his life. We received so many thoughtful items in our care packages. And as a result of these kinds of reviews, they were able to attract 20% more volunteers. This is an organization called Society of Singers. And they had this review shared by a singer. And I didn't know this, but apparently singers, when they're on tour, they get paid, but they also get medical insurance. And on the day that they leave the tour, they stop having any medical coverage at all. And so they are in a pretty precarious financial situation. This woman says, after Hurricane Katrina, I needed financial help to begin rebuilding my career in Chicago. It was scarier, colder, and for an unknown singer like myself. SOS was able to assist me with some of my utilities when the work was just not there for me. And this organization was able to raise $45,000 as a result of reviews like this by their beneficiaries. the way that we think about, so we had Florence Nightingale doing these one-to-one presentations, these in-person presentations. How can we get this information to scale? Wikipedia has done a fantastic job of that. Now, our information is a lot more narrow than that, but still there are various audiences in different parts of the world who want this kind of information. So we have changed our platform so that we have rebuilt it so that it's made for syndication. So we have partnered with other sites like Guidestar, Charity Navigator, Global Giving, where we provide the reviews technology for their site. We also provide reviews that nonprofits can also put on their own site. So an example of that is, this is the Guidestar site, and on the left-hand side are the reviews that we syndicate to them. They have primarily an institutional audience of funders, such as foundations, institutional investors. And so the reviews information is qualitative information that then complements the financial information that those investors will see. Here's an example on the nonprofit site. This is the Marine Science Institute. If you guys haven't visited there, it's a remarkable place. It's right in Redwood City, and you can go on in a boat and fish in the bay, and it's a very educational program. And they have put our little widget right on their homepage where you can see their reviews, and also it's encouraging people who've been participants in their program to give feedback and write a review. So when I look at what we're trying to do, the analogy I think about is, let's think about other sectors and how technology has really improved their effectiveness and their performance. So one example is the restaurant sector. So there has been a remarkable increase, as many of you guys have witnessed, in the quality and choices of restaurants that we can go to just in the past 10 years. In the late 1980s, it was kind of American food was kind of like American food. And now, all of a sudden, we have a plethora of choices and an incredible array of high-quality restaurants to choose from. And many of those people attribute those changes to the voice of the consumer now that is omnipresent. So you can write a review on Yelp. You can write a review on TripAdvisor. You can write a review on eOpinions about pretty much anything under the sky, including restaurants. When we looked at the Yelp effect, we've heard some anecdotes from restaurateurs. There's this one restaurant that was consistently getting reviews that said their portions were too small. So initially, the restaurant owner was just annoyed, didn't want to read it, didn't want to look at it. But then they decided actually to look at it constructively. So this restaurant, the cook then went back to the restaurant, and now they put a whole chicken on the plate rather than a half chicken. So the initial criticism was that the portions were small, the baked chicken was only half a chicken. So now they put an entire portion of chicken on the plate, as their customers demanded.
Half a chicken was too small.
Hotels is another example. So, in Paris, one of the most competitive hotel markets in the entire world, there's the Ritz-Carlton, there is all the major chains, and yet the top 3 sellout hotels are small, independent hotels because they have such amazing reviews from former guests who've been posting them on TripAdvisor. And so that's another great, I think, example for small organizations to think about, as small charities, as they think about, well, I'm trying to fundraise and I'm competing against the Red Cross. It is not as impossible as they might think. So one of the visions that we have of the future is that it is more open, it's more collaborative, and that this information is used to help donors make better decisions, and the information is actually used to make better solutions. So one of the projects that we're really impressed by is Open IDEO. This is the new IDEO Foundation initiative to crowdsource solutions to major social problems. They have a website where people can nominate projects, they can vote on projects, they can give feedback on projects. And part of our, our framework is that we need this open collaborative model of problem solving. We need technologists, we need nonprofits, we need beneficiaries, all to work together to create solutions that actually work. So this is the Open IDEO. If you haven't seen it, it's fascinating. They've got projects, they've got inspirational projects, they've got projects in conception mode, evaluation mode, winning concepts, and then projects that are in the realization mode. I'd say that one of the things that keeps me really engaged still, I've been doing this for 4 years, and usually, you know, they said at 4 years, kind of people peak and top out at their interest in whatever career they're in, is that this is such a growing problem. Humanitarian assistance, last year we spent $10 billion on humanitarian assistance. We're increasingly global. We're increasingly connected. We know about what's happening in tsunamis in Japan, tsunamis in East India. We know what's happening all over the world, and we all want to help. And so the increase in humanitarian aid has just been astronomical. And yet, there has still been little accountability and little transformation in the way that donors, nonprofits, beneficiaries interact. You know, right now there is probably 1 million people in Haiti who are still living in camps, right? And we don't know what they're thinking. We don't know what is it that they want, and we don't know their feedback. You know, the Red Cross has been much more proactive recently in publishing reports of what they have been doing. But what I would love to see is actually the voices of the people living in the camps telling us what they think of the Red Cross and what they need from the Red Cross. So this is a quote by one advocate of beneficiary voice who works in Haiti. He says, "You've got 1 million people who have been living in tents for a year. Does anybody know what they need, what they think, what their problems are? You need to include them in the conversation." So here are some emerging technologies that we're looking at that excites us about the possibility of including beneficiaries in the conversation. And our framework is technology is only so good in the way that people can use them. So only put appropriate technology in the hands of people who can use them. In Haiti, you know, our website is not going to work. They don't have internet connections. They don't have computers. So what are the kinds of technologies that might work in some of these developing countries? Very low tech. In some African countries, they're starting these hotlines where people can call in to complain about, you know, services of a nonprofit. They have increasingly these radio call-in shows. It's a relatively new format for some of these countries where they'll have experts, you know, talk about an issue, and then they'll invite their listeners to call in. And so some of the listeners will actually call in with feedback. Mobile data gathering is an interesting new way through SMS or through, you know, a mobile device to collect some of this information that we're looking at. A lot of the SMS work is still primarily being used as a communication device from the experts, from the nonprofits, to the beneficiaries rather than a listening technique. But increasingly, there are ways to collect surveys on SMS, so sending people one question at a time and collecting those kinds of results. So going back to our framework here, you know, the idea is how can you create the infrastructure that will make this loop happen, that will create the kind of market information that is absolutely necessary for an effective market mechanism. We do have some fantastic internships available. I wanted to put that out there in case you guys are interested. We're down in Silicon Valley in Menlo Park, and we are looking for people who have a technology interest in helping us think through these interesting, challenging issues of technology and how they can be used to really create this marketplace of feedback about nonprofits that will help donors, help nonprofits, and certainly help beneficiaries create more sustainable, more effective solutions to the problems that we see day to day. And I think that concludes my presentation. So.
Do you have any questions? We need to use the microphone, please. Have a question?
All right. Hi, thanks for the talk. I'm wondering if there's any kind of moderation for the content you gather from for reviews, and how do you detect the fabrication of content?
Yeah, that's really interesting. So we are actually working with some researchers at Cornell who've done research on what they call deceptive reviews. So they've looked at reviews on Amazon, for instance, and tried to detect patterns to help them, you know, automated ways to detect patterns and predict whether or not a review is accurate or not. And so they're actually working with us right now on that process. But currently what we have is we have our terms of use, so, you know, guidelines that every website has. And then we will look at things sometimes on a case-by-case basis. We have an editorial team. Yes.
Sorry.
How do you address the issue of populations that they don't have a written languages. Out of the 6,000 languages, there's only 200 of them are written languages.
Right.
So 5,800 is kind of left with no media representative.
Right, right.
So how do you address that?
Yeah, so there is a really interesting initiative by one of our partners, Global Giving, and they are working in Kenya to collect these stories. And the way that they do it is they hire local scribes. So people who will visit a village and sit down in front of someone and say, here's a piece of paper, can you write out for me what are the issues affecting your community in your language? And then they take them back, and these scribes then translate them into English and then put them up on the Global Giving site. So they're working with some professors at Oxford to then take all this qualitative information and then analyze it for trends. And they do a trend mapping, a visual mapping of the issues that you hear about in the communities. So they actually have local people transcribing. It's a very manual process.
I was wondering how you conceptualize this kind of market, introducing these market mechanisms into the not-for-profit sector in relation to the for-profit sector, because there's obviously market mechanisms, but there's not necessarily interoperability like what you're seeking.
Right. There is a lot more interoperability in the for-profit sector than we have in the nonprofit sector. For instance, the way that you can look up your credit information on Mint, right? Mint is actually talking to your bank to pull that information into your Mint account to see how much money you were spending on various things every month. In the nonprofit sector, there's not that much interoperability. So, for instance, there's not a unique ID in the nonprofit world. So, a lot of these relief agencies, they start with the words cooperative relief for blah, blah, blah. And they sound very similar. And there is no way that we know one is actually different from the other than slight differences in their name. So that's one of the things that we're creating with some of our partners is a unique ID, almost like a network domain registry, so that there is a unique ID attached to a unique nonprofit. There's also no such thing as a common nonprofit profile. So you might see a nonprofit listed on our site or one of our partner sites, and their names are slightly different and their mission statements are slightly different. That's because there's no common data form for the nonprofit to upload their mission statement or their program information and then have it to be syndicated everywhere yet. So that's another project that we're working with our partners, is a notion of an open ID for nonprofits, so that nonprofits don't have to keep adding their information in different places and the information is not always consistent. Yes? Oh, sorry.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I very much like the way you frame this problem as a market inefficiency, asymmetry of information, and all that. So my question is, the local nonprofits, as you put it, are necessary only because the big nonprofits fail and governments fail. Yet those entities are not a part of the market that you create. So given all this stuff that you can, you got these small local nonprofits competing against one another. How can we put those feedback to the institutional big nonprofits that fail and the governments that fail? Because the fact that the local nonprofits are necessary, that's a bad thing. That means all the big guys are failing.
Well, not necessarily. I mean, I think the closest analogy I have for local nonprofits is local businesses, right? We have Walmart, but we also have local mom and pop stores, and we, can choose between both of them. So I think, local nonprofits provide a very rich diversity of programs in their local community, and they understand the needs of those community, and they have volunteers that volunteer with them. And so, sometimes the local nonprofits, they partner with the national organization. So Goodwill, for instance, is an affiliate. It's a local autonomous organization here in San Francisco, but it's an affiliate of the national Goodwill Industries. And there are, Goodwills all around the country, and they're actually local because they're actually autonomous. So, sometimes they compete, and then sometimes they collaborate. But I think the role of local nonprofits is that they are, comprised of people we know. There are family members who volunteer there. They're people who really understand the needs of a local community, and that's why they're so different and diverse and really pretty remarkable. I think, the Marine Science Institute, for instance, the only one I know of that, they actually will take kids on these boats and go out into the bay, and they'll take kids who are like kindergarten out in the bay and let them fish and let them get dirty, and it's It's a really remarkable organization that I can't imagine, I can't quite imagine, Monterey Aquarium doing that, for instance. Yes?
So, I mean, can't you use the unique identifier with the government that you have as a nonprofit status?
Right, right. So every company in the country has an EIN number, right? And nonprofits certainly have EIN numbers, but that's only here for the United States. So as soon as you're talking about a nonprofit that's operating in Kenya or in East Asia, they don't have a U.S. government ID number assigned to them.
But they would most likely have an ID number in their jurisdiction.
Not always.
So in work with governments.
Yes, yes, and there's been some initiatives. For instance, like the most challenging place to work is actually, India, where you've got federal government, local municipalities, you've got states, and they don't always talk to each other. So there's many layers of bureaucracy, and so I think the idea is to kind of create an independent consortium of organizations who would create this common ID for nonprofits worldwide.
That sounds like a good idea.
It's a challenge, but we'll see.
Thank you. Is there any statistic on what percentage of donors' money actually go to the beneficiaries? And this layer of organization you talked about, I think it really brings down the beneficiaries, the amount they can really get out of the whole thing. If that information is also somehow part of the database, that gives a good feedback for the investors or the donors.
Yeah. So one of our partner sites, Charity Navigator, provides that kind of information. They'll tell you exactly what percentage of money goes to programs. And so the way that we see that is that is information about inputs. That's kind of like, if you go to a restaurant and, you learn how much the raw vegetables and chicken actually cost, right? That doesn't actually tell you about the outputs. What was actually created out of those raw materials? So I would say that administrative budgets kind of vary between, 40% to 10%. So that's the amount of money that the nonprofit might spend on expenses such as office, their rent, their fundraising costs, their marketing costs. Those numbers are also very fuzzy because some nonprofits count direct mail pieces as educational materials, and then they count them as part of their program rather than part of their administrative budget. So there's not really a lot of strong rules that the IRS provides for that guidance. So many nonprofits consider direct mail, which I consider advertising, as part of their educational programs. The other, main, I think, argument against using financial information as the main indicator is that it's kind of like picking the airline you want to fly on depending on how low the salary is of the pilot, right? You're trying to find the lowest cost staff, the lowest cost inputs. And so that doesn't always translate to the best social outcome. So what we're really interested in is, yes, we want a complete picture. Obviously, an organization, some of these veterans charities that have been really in the news about their scandals about not providing money to veterans, they're using 90% of their money on administration. That is obviously, there's some fraud going on in there. But if there's some reasonable expenses that a nonprofit needs to have rent, pay for their rent, pay for staff, quality staff, and then that picture is completed by information about the outcome of that organization, what kind of social value it actually creates. I think that creates a full picture. There's something right now called social impact bonds. I don't know if you guys have heard of it. It's this idea that nonprofits would raise money from private investors based upon a performance model. So there are certain things that social investors want, which is, less unemployment, more of these people who are not imprisoned anymore and not drawing from the government. And so individual investors invest in these companies, and then when these nonprofits achieve these social goals, these investors are then paid back by the government. It's an interesting model. So that's just starting. We're just starting to see that roll out.
So I had a question or maybe comment about the feedback from beneficiaries.
Yeah.
So what they tell you may not necessarily be related to the success of an operation. For example, you said there's a million people living in Haiti still in tents. which I think the fact that they're still living, that they've been living in tents for a year is a major success, as opposed to them getting wiped out by cholera or that kind of thing.
Right.
And that kind of thing probably won't show up in reviews. So how would you deal with this kind of thing?
Yeah, so the reviews are written by beneficiaries, and the other people who write reviews about them are also volunteers and donors. And so you have different kinds of perspectives on the same issue, and you will also see trends, right? So let's say if you ask someone who lives in a tent today what their experience is versus maybe 2 years down the road, it would be very different. And so you're going to see a trend. And what we advise people to do is, we live in an information age where we triage information all the time. You go to TripAdvisor, you go to Yelp. Yeah, there's going to be reviews you disagree about. There's going to be reviews by obviously crazy people. And there's going to be reviews by some people who are like, yeah, that person sounds like me. That person sounds like, someone that I would trust. And so we triage all the time to make decisions about which information sources we want to trust more than others. Yelp has their proprietary algorithm, which actually shows you reviews of people they think that you are likely to trust. And we're in the process of trying to create a similar algorithm. It's not going to be proprietary, but it's going to weigh the quality of the reviews and show you reviews by people who we predict are more likely to be credible and trustworthy.
I just wanted to thank you again for a great talk.
Thank you.
And if you have any other questions, you can ask after.
And my email's out there, so if anyone's interested in working on some of these technologies, contact me. Thanks. Oh, thanks. Yeah, it is. It's very. Hi, thanks for your question.